Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming to our program, Challenging the Cold War Narrative with journalist Joe Lauria. We're extremely pleased to have Mr. Lauria with us this evening. My name is Martin Schatz, and I am co-chair of the No Cold War Committee of Massachusetts Peace Action. The No Cold War Committee is dedicated to exposing, educating the public about, and opposing the vast Cold War narrative which envelops our society today. This Cold War narrative is aimed at creating false enemy images of other countries and their leaders and justifying U.S. militarism. After my introductory remarks, I will turn things over to our moderator for the evening, Joe Beal, who will be moderating the discussion after Mr. Lauria's formal presentation, and to Ellen Mass, who will introduce Mr. Lauria. Joe Beal is a longtime peace and justice activist who's a member of our No Cold War Committee and joins us from Portland, Oregon. Ellen Mass is a longtime member of Mass Peace Action and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She's also been involved for many years in various progressive causes, including developing the sister city relationship between Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Yerevan, Armenia, as well as work with civic commissions and other civic affairs. Ellen was instrumental in suggesting Mr. Lauria as a speaker for our group, thus making possible this evening's program. Ellen, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. I'm so thrilled that we're able to retain such a notable speaker tonight. Very fortunate to have Joe Lauria with us. He's a former journalist with the Boston Globe and a leading voice against the Cold War. He's currently an editor for Consortium News and reporting from the United Nations. He's been a contributor to many publications such as The Times, The Post, the Wall Street Journal, and The Guardian, as well as others. Along with former U.S. Senator and presidential candidate Mike Gravel, Mr. Lauria co-authored A Political Odyssey, The Rise of American Militarism, and One Man's Fight to Stop It. In his journeys to more than 70 countries, he's interviewed, among others, former presidents Barack Obama, Jimmy Carter, Hillary Clinton, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Jacques Chirac, Robert Mugabe, and Yasser Arafat. He's a friend of Julian Assange and is an active member of the Assange defense effort. For his efforts against militarism and imperialism, Mr. Lauria has been targeted by Hamilton 68, a white wing listserv on Twitter that attempted to blacklist progressive voices as anti-American. And this was, of course, taken off, totally debased and removed from Twitter. So let's hear from Joe. You can see his full Huffington Post bio on the chat when I get it up there.
Thank you very much, Ellen. I should ask you not to put that bio up because it's woefully out of date, for one thing.
Okay.
Just the bio that is attached to the end of my articles on Consortium News is the most accurate and up to date. Yes, I worked about 30 years in corporate journalism. I go back to manual typewriter days, and that helps inform what Consortium News is. Of course, begun by Robert Perry back in 1995, who was an AP investigative reporter who broke so many of the Iran-Contra stories. His stories were spiked by AP. He went to Newsweek. They were spiking his stories, including at AP, the major one where he revealed the name of Oliver North and his role in that scandal, one of the worst in American history, because people died because of it. The war continued in Nicaragua because of that scandal. They spiked that story, and Bob eventually got fed up and started Consortium News in 1995. I started writing for Bob in 2011 while I was working at the Wall Street Journal, of all places. But I started publishing articles there. So the point is, I'm not an activist. I'm very pleased to see so many people here tonight to listen to what I have to say. And I really thank you for inviting me here to talk about the new Cold War. And your mention of Hamilton 68, just to say that I was put on that list. We only found out 2 weeks ago by Matt Taibbi, because he's going through these Twitter files that have been made available to him. I was put on this list with 643 other people, or at least Twitter accounts. And that was used secretly to influence corporate media, particularly the big liberal cable networks, MSNBC, CNN, and the big liberal newspapers like the New York Times, to further the mania, really, of the Russiagate story. And it turned out that none of us were Russian agents or run by Russia. They lied and said to these people at Hamilton 68 told Twitty, we can't give you the names because Russia shut down their accounts. In other words, Russia was going to shut down my account. It's so absurd. It was before I became editor. It was back in 2016, at the end of 2016. Oh, I should say 17, but so that's a whole other story. And I'll get to that at the end. What has been the reaction to someone like myself, like our website, like other people and other alternative websites, to try to give context and history to what we're experiencing now, which is, I was just thinking, probably the most dangerous war, certainly since Vietnam. And there have been many wars since Vietnam, because this one, and some in the Middle East in 67 and 73, there were fears of drawing in the superpowers. This was what everyone has been trying to avoid since the end of the Second World War, a direct confrontation between two nuclear armed powers. And up until recently, there was a lot of care given to avoid that. I recall the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the campaign of 2016, when Hillary Clinton was calling for a no-fly zone over Syria. He testified, I think, to the House or Senate Armed Services Committee that he didn't think that that was a wise idea. He doesn't make the policy, but he just wanted everybody to know that could lead to war with Russia. And he didn't endorse that. So there was still a sense that we have to avoid this. Even at the beginning of this phase of the current conflict, a year ago, February, there was the Pentagon pulling back talk from Antony Blinken and some people in Congress, and sure behind the scenes, Victoria Nuland. The neocon contingent wanted to give NATO fighter jets from Poland to Ukraine. And Pentagon put their foot down. This is March, April last year. And Biden said, no, you can't have them. Why? Because they're afraid of a confrontation with Russia. Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, also came down on the side of no way we're giving those weapons. And now Blinken had already publicly said that they were considering that. He had to backtrack. But now we're talking about that again. We're at a stage of escalation that is extremely dangerous. And at the end of my talk, I'm going to say the only possible solution in the short term, anyway, to end this war are people like yourself, activists getting out there. And there's a big rally coming up on Sunday. And I'm hoping that's the start of something big on the Vietnam era scale protests, because don't see a lot of hope right now in the short term of this ending. And as long as it goes on, we're living on a knife's edge about whether this could escalate. People in power, both in the Kremlin and in the White House, are openly mentioning nuclear weapons. That's enough to put a chill down your back, I tell you that right now. So the topic of this talk is challenging the new Cold War. And what are the consequences of challenging the new war as part of this? But I need to do a very quick survey of the last 30 years. When the Cold War, the first Cold War ended, almost immediately after that, the seeds of the Second Cold War, were planted. And in order to understand this conflict right now in Ukraine, you've got to go back 30 years. And I will get more detailed as we move closer to the present. So 1990s in Russia was after the end of the Soviet Union and the ascendance of Boris Yeltsin to power, became an open door to Wall Street, Washington, finance capital from Europe, as Western Europe as well, to go in, pretty much team up with local Russian, mostly men who became oligarchs, to acid strip the state-owned industry, formerly state-owned, now thrown open, to gain control of those and enrich themselves back in Washington, in Wall Street, and these new class of oligarchs that cropped up, while impoverishing the Russian people. Lost many of the social safety nets that the Soviet Union, as imperfect as it was, provided them. That was a disaster for Russia, but Yeltsin was very much Washington's man. In 1990, even before the Soviet Union collapsed, just before that, there was a meeting in Paris on November 19 to 21st, 1990. European governments were there, Canada and the US and the Soviet Union, and they agreed on what is known as the Charter of Paris for New Europe, or the Paris Charter. This is important to start this story because that charter envisioned a Europe integrated with Russia as part of a European security system that would not have the West take advantage of winning the Cold War, would not do what they subsequently did, what I just described, to go in and impoverish Russia and enrich themselves, loot them, carpetbagging is what went on there, in cahoots with certain Russians. And this Charter of Paris, together with the Helsinki Accords, led to the development of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. And this is an important organization in this story. Now, what happened is before the Soviet Union ended, before Germany was reunited, and many of you probably know this story because it has come up. It was briefly mentioned even in mainstream, and now it's gone. There were meetings between James Baker, the Secretary of State for Bush Sr., with Genscher, the foreign minister of West Germany at the time, and Gorbachev and other Soviet officials. A deal was made for the Soviets to agree to the reunification of Germany and the disbandment of the Warsaw Pact. The Western officials, including Baker, agreed not to expand NATO and fill the vacuum in Eastern Europe that the Warsaw Pact's dissolvement would create. There was going to be a vacuum there. Gorbachev went to his grave last year, probably regretting not getting that in writing in a formal treaty. Not that it would have necessarily stopped the United States, because there's a long history of the United States signing treaties they had no intention of honoring and later dishonored. I'm not saying this would have happened here. It would have been better to have that, but that's not a guarantee of U.S. misdeeds anyway. He didn't. However, and this was a contested story for a long time because there was nothing written, but about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, the National Security Archive at George Washington University here in Washington, D.C. said, discovered these documents, got them through FOIAs, and published them. And these were notes, memos written about those discussions. So while there was no formal treaty, it was certainly in writing that that deal had been made. So nobody could say that that's just an apocryphal story, never happened. They're making it. It was discussed, and that agreement was made. It was broken. In the Clinton administration, the drive to expand NATO into that vacuum that the Soviets had willingly vacated began. We got warnings at that time from Americans like William Burns, who's CIA director now, was an ambassador to Moscow, from George Kennan, who was, of course, the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union after the war, and who was the architect of the containment theory of the Cold War, the first Cold War, and even Joe Biden, as Senator Joe Biden on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, all acknowledged one way or another that expanding NATO was not necessarily a good idea because it would anger the Soviets, the Russians rather, and cross the red line. Now, Joe Biden didn't say he was against, he was for it. But he acknowledged on a video, you could find it on Twitter, he says, I know that this is going to probably get a hostile reaction from the Russians, but subscript, we're going to do it anyway. Whereas Kennan was saying, don't do it, this is not wise. And Burns was saying they mean no and they're serious. It was ignored. At the time, and we saw one country after the other become part of NATO, former Warsaw Pact nations. Yeltsin, who, as I said before, was America's man, he objected to it. He wasn't that much of a puppet that he couldn't say, wait a minute, this is not in our interest. Basically, they told him to shut up, because they ignored him. He was definitely against this expansion of NATO, but it happened anyway in the 90s. And during the 90s, of course, Zbigniew Brzezinski was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, and he plays kind of an important role in all this story. He wrote that book that he's very well known for now as The Grand Chessboard, it's called. And he says in there that if Russia loses control of Ukraine, it ceases to be, a superpower. It becomes only a backward Asian empire. It's no longer a Eurasian power. It's only an Asian power. Ukraine was the foothold to get if you wanted to weaken Russia. Keep that in mind. Now, he went on to advise many presidents after he left office up until Barack Obama, and he only died a couple of years ago. So he was an advisor to Obama during the years of 2014, which are really crucial in this story, of course. Yeltsin leaves office New Year's Eve, 1999. That day, the day before the new millennium, a former KGB official named Vladimir Putin became president. He said that he was reluctant, he didn't want to do it. Anyway, he found a Russia that was devastated in terms of the population, living standards. By the end of the Soviet Union, he saw his country dominated by the United States, by private finance companies, who like Goldman Sachs, who, by the way, went in and worked on this voucher system where if you got these vouchers, you were able to own part of a formerly state-owned company. It was total corruption. It was a complete chaos. And to make this long story about Putin short and why they hate him so much in the West, because he started to put his foot down. And this was a long process. And we really saw it for the first time in 2007. At least the West became very aware, and I think alarm bells went off in the halls of Congress, the State Department, the Pentagon, the CIA, that here's this Russian president making this speech at the Munich Security 7 major annual conference where leaders from all countries are there. So all the Western countries are represented there, Asia and Russia, everybody's there. And you could see this speech on YouTube. Pivotal moment because he condemned the U.S. invasion of Iraq and in general the unilateralism of the United States, that they're bullying the world, that they took advantage of the winning the Cold War, that he mentions what I've just mentioned about reneging on the agreement not to expand NATO. That's a big part of this speech. He lays it all out there. You can listen to that speech today and understand very well what's going on in Ukraine right now. He laid the foundation for what his position was. And little by little, he kicked out these Western capitalists. He kept some of it. He made a deal with the oligarchs. He said, if you stay out of politics, I'll let you go. But if you get involved in politics, I'm kicking you out. He got his own oligarchs, but they're loyal to him. But essentially, he tamed that and broke the alliance with the West that was, many of them moved to London or wherever, and Cyprus took their money. But he started to regain control of Russia, to get sovereign control over the Russian economy. Now, it's not up to me or any of us to decide whether he's a good leader or not. It's up to the Russian people. And he, because of that, has been quite popular by rather objective opinion polls. Maybe not as high as they say, 80 or 90%, but the Russian people have appreciated what he's done. And I have a personal story that shocked me because I've been twice in Russia. The first time was November of 1995, and it was total chaos. This is Yeltsin. This is in the middle of that period, this kind of Wild West period and I remember meeting, by the way, people who worked on Wall Street who were in Lithuania, and they came back to New York, and I met them at parties, and they just talked about how much money they were making and putting down the Russian people. It was disgusting behavior, actually. So that was a time in 95 when it was complete chaos. I remember in front of a train station, there must have been 150 people sleeping in front of the station, building fires and oil drums. I had to run away from guys who were about to rob my camera. The cab I was in was stopped, and I saw the driver give a bribe to the police. Another driver wouldn't allow me to sit in the front. He thought I was a Chechen. He was scared. I mean, I grew up in New York City in the Bronx, so I know in the 70s. And I know what that kind of fear of social instability around you. You step out of your house, you can get killed that day or robbed, mugged easily. Well, that spirit came back to me. It reminded me of those days in the South Bronx or even in the part of the Bronx I grew up. Now, fast forward exactly 20 years to 2015, November 2015, exactly 20 years later. I went back to Moscow, and I also visited St. Petersburg on this trip. Excuse me. And it's night and day. I'd left Berlin to go there, and it was another European city, clean, lit up, beautiful that I never remembered to be so organized. And what happened in those 20 years? Well, something happened. They gained control of their country. Now, that doesn't make people in Washington here very happy, or up in New York and Wall Street either, right? They want that country again, I think, I'm sure, to be under their dominance again. Two main reasons. One, that there is incredible resources in Russia. Minerals, gold, gas, oil, you name it. The U.S. is a country with more finite resources than that. And number two, just pure power politics. Empires exist by having to keep expanding. That's what does them in the end, but they can't stay pat. They can't say, okay, we've got enough territory now. We've got enough power in the world. We'll let those people free. I'm reminded of a story of a Roman general. I can't remember his name, but he was in Britain, and he was able to see Ireland across the sea, and he asked his aide, what is that? And that man, his aide, told him that's just a land of uncivilized barbarians. And we'd have to, no. If they exist, we have to do something about it. So this is the American mentality. You cannot let any country exist that doesn't go along with your plan, with your foreign policy that serves American interests. And we've seen countless. Don't forget, the United States, after the Second World War, almost by accident, really came up with a world empire. They had bases all over the world to fight Second World War. The war ended. The entire world basically was destroyed, except for the United States, which was enriched by the armaments manufacturing that went on, and it saved the U.S. from the Depression. And by the way, right after the war ended, there was a real fear that the recession and a depression would start again. And they even manufactured a scandal about the Russians being off the coast in submarines, and that the airline industry was just being destroyed because there was no more demand. There's a good book about that. I could tell you about it later. This was a fear, that beginnings of the Cold War, to create fear in Congress and in the United States that the Russians will come in for us. They were always going to be stronger than they actually were. The CIA has a long history, you could talk to Ray McGovern, long history of inflating the power of Soviet arms to continue this industrial base of manufacturing munitions inside the U.S., which saved in those days the country going back to the depression it was in before the war, and has now unfortunately become a core part of the American economy, where we have exported manufacturing to so many other countries. Every state has something to do with building a bomb or a gun or a missile. And that is still unfortunately the case right now. And I don't see that changing. Putin, I think, put the fear of God in these people, because he said, no more, we don't accept what the U.S. is doing around the world unilaterally. We're going to resist it. That was 15 years ago. A lot of things have happened since then. Next year, 2008 NATO conference. That was the famous one where George W. Bush said that Georgia and Ukraine would become members. Scared the bejesus, alarmed the Russians. They reacted very harshly to that, as Kennan and Biden even had all said back from the 90s that Russia would do, as long as you keep expanding NATO, getting closer and closer and closer to the Russian border, putting more and more troops in the former Warsaw Pact nations, and then developing missiles to put into Romania and Poland. A big part of, again, the crisis that led to the current phase of the war last February. So in 2009, there was also this small war in Georgia which a lot of Americans, because that's the way the media presents it, show it as an invasion by Russia of Georgia. And that's not what happened if you believe the European Parliament, which did a study and concluded that Georgia started that little skirmish, that short war. And it appeared that Saakashvili, the president, and the guy used to eat his tie on camera, he was very close to John McCain then and one of McCain's aides. And one has to assume that he understood, incorrectly turned out, that NATO would come to his aid if he picked a fight with Russia. And basically, he did a lot of damage to Russia. First of all, we're in Abkhazia, a breakaway part of Georgia that was majority Russian, ethnic Russian, that the Russians were there as peacekeepers, okay? Georgia attacked, Russia then wiped them out. This is the invasion of Georgia by Russia, okay? So in the next year, Russia said, all right, we had enough of this. They came up with a proposal for a new security arrangement. Now, Dmitry Medvedev is now the president, not Putin in this period. The guy that Hillary Clinton said we could do business with him. So I think they definitely wanted Putin out because, as I said, he was standing up for Russia. He was kicking out some of the Americans' favorite oligarchs. He was a guy they couldn't do business with, but Medvedev could maybe, and he did a very serious mistake, one could say, when he voted, he abstained, basically. I was there at the Security Council because for 25 years, that was my beat, UN headquarters in New York, for the Boston Globe, the German press agency, the Montreal Gazette, the Johannesburg Star, and the Boston Globe. And then that's what I was doing for the Globe. And also then at the end for the Wall Street Journal, about as opposite to my politics as possible. But I worked for them. I was there when they abstained with China on the vote that authorized the NATO mission in Libya, which was only supposed to be a no-fly zone, not a ground operation. Turned out to become a ground operation to overthrow Gaddafi, which was not the aim of that. It was to protect people. Responsibility to protect turned into a regime change operation. That's a whole nother story we could talk about another time. I'd only brought it up now to illustrate that Medvedev was not as strongly, was easier to manipulate, it seems, in the hands of the West than Putin was. And we know Putin was pissed off about that. He was prime minister, but the Constitution gave the power at that time to Medvedev. Medvedev came up with this new proposal to create a new pact in Europe. This was in 2009. He says, I'm convinced that Europe's problems won't be solved until its unity is established and an organic wholeness of all its integral parts, including Russia. This is what they were seeking in 2009. A new pact that he said it should replace the outdated institutions, Russia said, such as NATO and the Organization for Security and Cooperation and the OSCE. So by now, the OSCE was not functioning the way it should. NATO was becoming aggressive by expanding, taking advantage of the good faith of Gorbachev to disband the Warsaw Pact and allow the reunification of Germany. Do you think that they took that seriously? Of course not. So in 2009, they were just ignored. Now, I'm going to skip to 2014. There was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. Remember what I said about Brzezinski saying Ukraine is key to weakening Russia, to relegating it to just an Asian power and no longer a Eurasian power. So Ukraine was key. Now, go back to 49 or even earlier, 48. The CIA had been working with extreme right-wing neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine. The Bandera gang, and that was OUNB and the OUNA were the split that they had. They didn't work with Bandera, the CIA. They worked with this guy, Mykola Lebed, who was a close kind of right-hand man of Bandera. And they brought him to New York, set him up in the office there, and sent him back to Soviet Ukraine to sabotage operations and propaganda. He ran a whole thing up until 1990, up until the unification, the independence of Ukraine. And I know this from a U.S. government study. The link I could give to you later if you want. This was not just some conspiracy theory. There's a long book basically written by a branch. I can't remember which agency, I will tell you. I read the book. It explains all of this, that the U.S. worked and CIA worked with Ukrainian fascists all through the Cold War. And that's not surprising because we know about Operation Paperclip and all the Nazis that were some brought to the US. That Gehlen, the head of the Nazi intelligence service, the chief intelligence official of Nazi Germany, made a deal with Allen Dulles. He led Dulles to where all the files were hidden, the Nazi files, so the CIA was able to get, or at that time the OSS, able to get hold of the Nazi files. And what happened to this Gehlen? He became the head of the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, which is the West German intelligence agency. Extraordinary that the former head of Nazi intelligence became the head of West German intelligence. Be that as it may, there's this link with the Nazis and the US that's important here. So in the Orange Revolution, there was a disputed election between Viktor Yanukovych, and Yushchenko. The Americans backed Yushchenko, and they did not like Yanukovych, and they had to do a re-election after demands in the square. And Yushchenko won. One of the first things he did is the guy who got poisoned. His face became all pockmarked. We remember him that way. Probably the Russians did it. No absolute proof. But one of the first things he did was to make Stepan Bandera, who was the leader of the Ukrainian fascist, World War II era fascists, a hero of Ukraine. A few years later, there was another election. Yanukovych won this time, fair and square, according to the OSCE, which monitored this election. One of the first things Yanukovych did was take the status of hero of Ukraine away from Bandera. But in this time, many statues of Bandera have gone up, memorials, and they are celebrating his birthday on January 1st with torchlit marches in Lvov and in Kiev and other parts of Ukraine. There was definitely a revival of that cult that never went away, but the cult of Ukrainian fascism. Now, this is not, I hate this use of the word fascism today, I have to say, because it's overused and it's become meaningless. These guys, that's the real F word, I'm telling you. Now, in 2014, and we know that Victoria Nuland, who was then Assistant Secretary of State for East Eurasian Affairs, said in a speech that the U.S. government had spent $5 billion to try to bring democracy to Ukraine, even though they had elections there. And the NED worked there, the National Endowment for Democracy. A lot of you must know that they work as David Ignatius wrote a piece in 1990 in the Washington Post in which he quotes this guy called Gershon, who was the head of the NED and stayed the head of the new National Endowment for Democracy. He remained the head of it until just a few years ago when he died. And he said, basically, this piece said that they are doing openly now what the CIA used to do covertly, which is to overthrow governments. Right there in the Washington Post. And essentially, they worked to build up opposition to Yanukovych, who was duly elected, who was the leader of Ukraine. And when he decided to take a Russian deal rather than the European Union deal, I mean, that's when things were set into motion. And these right-wing fascistic groups sprung into action, and they set up the Maidan, and there was violence, and Yanukovych fled for his life. It's called a coup d'etat. He was an elected leader. A revolution is generally against a king or a monarch or a dictator that you revolt, overthrow him because there's no other means to get rid of him. There were means to get rid of Yanukovych, namely the next election. And of course, he made a deal with the Europeans to move up those elections if the Maidan Square was cleared and they brought back peace. He signed that deal. Germany and France were guarantors, and they agreed to it. And the next day, and a piece I wrote in response to NewsGuard giving us a red mark about the rise of and the history of neo-Nazism in Ukraine. It's one of the links that are on the website announcing this event. I trace the entire history there, and one of them is about the Nazis, the other is the evidence of a coup. And there's a lot of detail there about when they took over government buildings, and was it before Yanukovych left or after? Well, certainly before. They were taking over the government, and he had to flee for his life. So they took over. What happened in the eastern Donbass provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk is the people who largely elected Yanukovych, resisted the coup. You could call them pro-democracy supporters, wouldn't you? Well, of course, they're not, because they wanted Yanukovych, the guy they elected, and they refused to accept this new coup government that we know that the United States had a big role in installing, because we had that leaked tape of Nuland talking to the American ambassador, in which he said F the EU, and they made a deal. It was scotched. Yanukovych was gone. These thugs, right sector, Azov battalion that came on later, they moved on a union building in Odessa and killed 35 people, I believe, in a fire. They burned them alive. 5 days later, Luhansk and Donetsk declared independence from Ukraine. That led to a war against those breakaway republics by Petro Poroshenko and the US-backed Ukraine coup government that made use of and had alliances with, or at least tolerated, these neo-Nazi groups. I've never said and never written and do not believe that the entire government is a Nazi government, or that even that it's infested with Nazis, but because they do very poorly in the elections. Clearly, these political extreme right-wing political parties don't do well in Ukraine, because Ukrainian people don't like them either, but they have an extra parliamentary power that they use intimidation. They have police on their side in many cases. They're a scourge, and they have built up and became a big force, being paid by oligarchs directly, some like their private armies, to go and fight these dirty ethnic Russians who want to break away from Ukraine in what happens to be the richest agricultural, mineral, and one of the most richest mineral and manufacturing areas of Ukraine, the Donbass area, which borders, of course, on Russia. Russia helped those people with materiel, intelligence, logistics, volunteers, tanks. This became a Russian invasion. And there was never any evidence of a really serious Russian invasion back in 2014. We know what happened then in Crimea. No shots were fired. A referendum was held. Those troops were already based at Crimean. Russian troops were already allowed to be in Crimea. They could leave those bases with the agreement of the president. Yanukovych was still the president in their eyes. Anyway, they went and provided security for this referendum, and they overwhelmingly voted to leave Ukraine and join Russia. This was in response to the 2014 violent coup. I do not think if that didn't happen, that today Crimea would be part of Russia, and the subsequent events would not have happened. Now, why do I think the United States wanted this invasion? Because they wanted it to have a cause. They needed a cause to launch three things: an economic war of unprecedented proportions against Russia to try to bring down its economy and bring down its president. Number two, an information war that would demonize Russia in a way never seen before in my lifetime anyway, to ban the importation of Russian cats, fire orchestra conductors, prohibit Dostoevsky from being taught in a Western university. This kind of cultural, taking tennis players away who have nothing to do with politics, not allowing them to participate in Grand Slam events, this kind of unprecedented fury against Russia all came about because the U.S. wanted this invasion. So they had the economic war and the information war and the proxy war. In other words, the U.S. is fighting a war against Russia using Ukrainian troops trained and armed by NATO. When did that happen? That happened after the 2015 Minsk Accords, which would have seen Donetsk and Luhansk remaining part of Ukraine, but being autonomous, staying inside Ukraine. That was signed, and that was an agreement that was made, that was guaranteed by Germany and France, and they were supposed to implement it. It went to the UN Security Council, which endorsed it. In other words, it became international law, almost the status of a treaty. It had to be implemented, and we only just found out a few weeks ago from Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, and Petro Poroshenko, the leaders of those three countries at the time, that they never intended to implement those accords ever. Why? Because they wanted to deceive Russia and give time to Ukraine to build itself up, to be trained and equipped by NATO equipment, NATO forces going there to run war games with them. Was that to defend themselves against a Russian invasion? Now, they had 8 years to do a real Russian invasion. And now Putin has said that was a mistake he made, that he didn't do it earlier. This was seen by Russia as an offensive move, even if it's claimed to be defensive on the Ukrainian and the NATO side. They deceived Russia to build up the forces of NATO, which is one reason Russia's having such a hard time in this war, because they're fighting NATO. They're not Western soldiers, they're the Ukrainian soldiers. But it's a NATO force, a NATO-trained, outfitted force. And this is one reason, again. This is so good. So the Minsk Accords, the failure of the Minsk Accords, they didn't want to implement those accords. Then in December of 2021, Russia came up with another treaty proposal to NATO and the United States, very similar to the 2009 proposal. This was a formal treaty in which the United States and NATO would agree to remove their forward deployments from former Warsaw Pact nations and those missiles from Poland and Romania that could reach Moscow in a matter of minutes to be pulled back, and Ukraine would never join NATO. Those were the main part of those treaty proposals. And what happened? The United States just laughed at them, basically. Blew them off, never happened. But Putin said, if you don't do this, we will take military technical measures. What did that mean? It meant he was going to invade. In this phase, he was going to enter the civil war that was still ongoing. There was an uptick of shelling. OSCE statistics show in February of last year, under Donbass, there was a trap being set. Would Russia cross the line? Cross the line. That's what Biden said. If they crossed that line, then we were going to shut down the Nord Stream pipeline. If they cross that line, we're going to impose incredible sanctions on Russia. If they cross that line, we're going to put unbelievable disinformation about Russia out there to blame them for everything that's ever happened. And by the way, Russia in 2016 helped create the groundwork for this, prepare the American people for this kind of unbelievable demonization of Russia. That is certainly not is a state that does things wrong. That is not an innocent partner necessarily here, but they are not can be blamed for everything that goes wrong, like the Hamilton 68 dashboard, which was full of Americans, with complete nonsense, like the Hunter Biden laptop. That was Russian disinformation. Now they've had to admit it was not Russian disinformation. Like they're going to shut down Vermont's electric station, and Maddow told her audience on MSNBC. And no, that was the absolute amount of stories that were completely false about Russiagate is astounding. So where are we now today? They rejected the treaty proposal. They set up a trap, and I did a piece on February 4th, 2022, 20 days before the invasion, is saying that they're setting a trap up, and I gave the examples of the U.S. entrapping Iraq, getting Iraq to invade Kuwait so that they could launch a war against Iraq to defang them. That's the word they actually used, after the U.S. built up Iraq to defeat Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. And there's no question that was a trap, and you can read the piece I wrote. I gave details, and most importantly is the Afghan war that the Soviets were drawn in by the admission of Mr. Brzezinski, who said in that 1999 Nouveau Observateur interview that it was a trap. He used the word trap. We set a trap for the Soviets. We got them to invade. So then we armed the Mujahideen, and we were able to destroy them. That was their Vietnam. We gave the Soviet Union their Vietnam, and that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union within 10 years. And I believe that they're trying to give the Russian Federation their Vietnam. And I'll just close here by saying that it's backfiring. This trap is entrapping the West. The economic sanctions did not work. The ruble is stronger than ever. The IMF just put out a report saying they expect growth to return to the Russian economy. They are not suffering. Europe is suffering. The sanctions have backfired. We all know about the heating costs, about people who either heat or eat in Britain. It's been a disaster, the inflation that it's helped to cause. Number two, the information wars only worked in the West. Nobody outside of the United States and Europe believes that. Not everyone inside the United States or Europe believes it either. But certainly everywhere in the rest of the world, we're talking about China, India, Africa, Latin America. Not only did they not buy the American disinformation and propaganda about this war, but they have created now, they are in the process of creating a new economic, monetary, commercial, mercantile system amongst themselves, where they're going to cut the US dollar out. They are creating an alternative economic global system that cuts out the West. And the United States is not realizing this, that they're going to be on the outside looking in. They're already on the outside looking in, and they better understand that pretty soon. And it's very frightening to know how an angry humiliated, monstrous empire like the United States will react when they realize finally that they're losing. And it looks like there are people in the Pentagon or some factions who are telling Biden, let's settle this thing now, cut our losses, have a deal. They're going to have to give up territory to Ukraine, but we can't. It's getting too dangerous. We're running out of munitions. We can't supply the Ukraine. This can't go on forever. Where the idea was to have this war go on forever to keep bleeding Russia. And they're hardcore neocons who want this to keep going on because they still think they could overthrow Putin somehow. And all the evidence has been to the contrary. The U.S. is losing this war that they helped launch against Russia, fighting, using Ukraine as their proxies. They're losing it. And it better end soon because we are headed down a very dangerous road. And again, it begins maybe next Sunday here in Washington with the protest that has to spread to the kind of numbers that we saw in 1982, the campaign for nuclear disarmament in Britain, the big Central Park meeting in New York in 82, and before the Iraq invasion. But what happened that day? Millions of people, largest protests on a single day in history, and it didn't stop the U.S. from invading Iraq and Britain. They never got a Security Council authorization. It was illegal. Didn't stop them. Now they have the audacity to talk about other countries breaking international law when the U.S. has broken international law so often it's become meaningless. It's become meaningless. I think I'll stop there. I'm sure you got a lot of questions, and I appreciate all the time that you gave me.
Wow. Wow, Joe. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. What a great history lesson, going into the background, the causes, and what we can do today. Yes, now we have a wonderful opportunity to ask Joe questions. And so just as a reminder, if you'll look below your screen, reactions, click on that and raise your hand to ask a question. And I see that Timothy is ready to go. Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to leave my video off if that's okay. I'm just wondering a little bit why there are still enough Ukrainians left willing to give their lives to this ignoble cause. I mean, I can understand that there's some extreme fascists, but they're not the majority. And I understand there are also quite a few foreign mercenaries fighting in Ukraine now, too. So what is the Ukrainian army these days anyway?
Well, they're now press ganging young men off the streets. A lot of videos are emerging where if you're out shopping, you might wind up getting grabbed by 3 or 4 uniformed military personnel, and they'll drag you off and throw you out to the front. Look, from a local perspective, your country's been invaded by Russia. If you don't understand all this background, which, by the way, the corporate media does not want the American people to understand very well. You never hear this. This is what we had at Consortium News. PayPal banned us permanently. It had to be because of our Ukraine coverage, because there's something in the user agreement saying we can't publish disinformation. We had NewsGuard give us a red mark. We've had, I wound up on Hamilton 68. So there's a real concerted effort to stop people from reporting some of this background, to give context. Because then by the way, this is nothing new. I mean, in all the years I worked at corporate media, I was always frustrated that ancient history was 2 weeks ago on a daily newspaper in the United States. They always took out the context because that changes so much of a story. I mean, you can lie without telling a lie. Just take out a lot of truth. Take out a lot of important facts. You've got a whole different story. Like now, all of a sudden, Putin woke up one day and he decided to spun the globe and put his finger there.
I agree, but you're not really answering my question.
I'm getting to it.
Okay, thank you.
They are fighting. Just a lot of the young men are fighting to defend their country. So if you look at it on a local level, and they don't understand themselves maybe the entire history of this, we have to look at this local conflict and globally. globally, that's what I've been discussing tonight, where we all understand it's a conflict between the United States and Russia. But not when you're a Ukrainian, maybe not very well educated guy. You grew up in that country. Your country was invaded. That's the way it's framed, certainly by the Ukrainian media and the politicians as well as Western media. So you're defending your homeland. A lot of them are committed, deep nationalists who despise Russia all along. So they're motivated, but a lot of them are just being drafted and thrown out there and who probably don't want to be there. And yes, there are foreign mercenaries right from the very beginning. There have been evidence of that. So I think, again, there's the hardliners. There are those who don't really want to be there. There are others who really are defending their country against an invasion. And we have to see it from that angle as well.
Okay, thank you. Looks like Alan Benslet.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Joe, for that very detailed and continuous history of the situation leading up to the present. It's really helpful to hear it all put together. But I wanted to ask, about the peace movement and to comment on that. I agree that is the only solution is public protest and those of us who aren't, part of the elite and the government sort of protesting. And hopefully that will build. And we have Code Pink, we have MAPPA, we have, other organizations doing their best to do it. But unfortunately, the info wars that you mentioned has been really successful and effective. And so many people just don't understand and just don't see, the provocation of the US and the West. And so the peace movement is so small. It's so different from the time of the Iraq War in 2003, when I participated in New York City. You had that million person march. It was thrilling. It was wonderful, but it's so different. I went to a demonstration at Times Square in January and maybe 200, 300 people. That's all in New York. So how do we deal with that? Is it just a matter of time? Do we have the time really to build the peace movement, given the threats and the dangers of this conflict? So anything you can say in relation to this?
Never been more urgent. But if you look at the beginnings of the Vietnam protests, at the very start, there weren't a lot of Vietnam protests. There was only 2 members of Congress. Ernest Gruning, I think, was one of them in Alaska, and this other guy from Ohio, I can't remember his name now, those were the only 2 who spoke out. They voted against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. I think it was only those 2 or a few people in the House. I don't remember exactly the details. What I'm trying to say is in Congress and in the public and in the media was pro-war, and then something changed. And Pentagon Papers had something to do with that. The losses in after the Tet Offensive and the draft, the fact that there was a draft, and this really is what we don't have now, because the draft made it an unpopular war. So the country was ripe for some kind of opening of their eyes, finally, after all of this, these lies about Vietnam, and they were winning and all that. Well, we're seeing those lies now too. They're not winning. Russia is not losing this war. It's a slog, but you cannot say that Ukraine is winning and that they're going to win this thing. They have to get realistic here and end it. So how do the people get out on the streets? As I said, Sunday's a big rally. There's controversy because there's all different groups that are quite in disagreement on a lot of other issues there. There's some groups there that are offending people, and they don't feel they can take part because some of the leaders are, not just a political difference, but statements they've made about their ethnicity. So that's like an article we published today by Chuck Zlatkin, and he was writing about that day in '82 when he was in Central Park and helped organize some of these feeder demonstrations into the park. There was a fight between some who were pro and some were anti-abortion. And he was able to get them to just march separately. So there were Buddhists there and communists and Catholics and all kinds of people. March, that's what we need today. There's no question about that. I think there's not the fear anymore of nuclear weapons like there used to be. Now, a lot of us here may have been old enough, I was, to remember going under my desk in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So I actually believed it might have protected me, this very flimsy desk. But in any case, that fear is gone now. The old Cold War at least had a fear of annihilation that I think works not only on the people, but on the leaders. We can't even lightly talk about the use of nuclear weapons, let alone really contemplate that. And that's gone now. There's also these new tactical nuclear weapons they think they could use and win a war without a massive exchange. So I don't think there's got to be that fear. That fear of nuclear war led that 1982 turnout of 1 million people. And I think close to 1 million or more even in London around the same time the campaign for nuclear disarmament. So I don't know. There's not that fear. Look, we can't get through to them. And you're absolutely right. The media is far more effective now. Because in those days, reporters still had some sense of reporting news and not being so overtly following an American agenda, although they did. I mean, Cronkite went over there at first to praise these guys, our war effort, and something happened. He changed. That was a really important moment. We need somebody, some anchor person. And I don't see it happening at MSNBC or CNN saying, look, this, it's sounding like me tonight, right? This is a proxy war. It was provoked. It's got to end because we could all die here now. And let's just end it right now. Russia's going to win some territory, but it's got to end right now. Otherwise, it's going to be a total victory for them or total annihilation if the United States insists on escalating this war. So I don't know. I just think that we need the fear of nuclear weapons again back in the populace, and we need to hear it from the media. We need people to think for themselves, obviously. There was a poll that came out today from the Associated Press reporter. You may have seen it. 51% of the public thinks that the mainstream media is purposely deceiving the country for their own agenda. Interesting. Half the country. That's got to change.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you all. Ellen, do you have a question?
Following Alan's point about the need for more greater and more profound protest, and Joe's expose of the earlier history of Russia and the U.S.-Russian conflict, but especially the goal of weakening the country, the other side, weakening Russia. I've also wondered whether beneath the need to make a difference is by being overtly demonstrative, is the underlying Russia-phobia. I've called it that. People don't like the word, but I feel it's almost as endemic as racism. It's so deep, and it goes to some of the things you were talking about, this hatred that you brought out in different points during your talk. You see the vehemence and the some of the behavior that shows this level, and that because the media is so thoroughly propagandistic, how can we address Russia-phobia within our own groups and our own selves? I really feel it's everywhere, even in our most progressive networks. How do we deal with it? Yes, we can read books, we can have groups come together, but what would you suggest? Or am I a little bit off base?
No, I think that's an extremely important question you're raising. And I would say that you have to somehow see things from a Russian's perspective. Put yourself in their shoes as best as possible. Get a Russian citizen, if you can get one, can come and speak to you, who's not necessarily, some ideologue or Putin lover or something, but a guy who understands what it was like in the 1990s to give you the Russian, not mine. I know most from reading. I told you I went twice to Russia. I don't know the language, but get a Russian to tell you this is what it was like. And I was at a dinner party a couple of months ago, and there were two Russians there, academics. And and I was talking like this at that dinner party. And that's what happened in the 1990s. They could tell you. Maybe I can get those two people to address you. I'll try to get you there. It's a husband and wife, I believe. So they're both academics in Washington. What is it? What is the Russian perspective? Now, they're going to have to criticize things that are going on there. You know, things are, she did criticize. She told the story of this woman about there are soldiers being sent like American soldiers to the front without any proper equipment. And that you have to, people are chipping in to give their sons and their employees at one factory. The boss at the factory bought all out of his own pocket, bought military equipment, armor to give to the soldiers who were being sent to fight in Ukraine. So the same kinds of things that happen in the US, there were stories like that here of American soldiers who the families have to chip in to buy armor against these improvised explosive devices in Iraq. They didn't have the proper armor. I mean, so there's a lot of things that are going on that we can learn about that are not good in Russia right now as well. And that there might be a limited amount of speech that's allowed, like there is here. Here, we're not allowed to criticize the war, and over there, you know, maybe the same thing. But I think it's popular from what I can understand, but it would be good to get a Russian perspective, how they see the last 30 years of this history. Not only that they have a great culture that we've all benefited from going back before that, from the 19th century Russian novelists to the music, ballet, etc., but incredible contribution to Western civilization, and they've always been pushed out. Not to be part of Europe. And this has been the downfall of Russia in many ways. Like Peter the Great, Europeanized the whole thing. And they all spoke French in the court. He created St. Petersburg. It's a completely Western European looking city. And Gorbachev also wanted to go to the West. Putin, he asked Clinton to join NATO. I didn't mention that back in the 90s. They laughed at him. He wanted to join NATO. That because they just want to be part of a security arrangement where this thing won't happen, where they could feel secure. The OSCE treaty says that everyone has agreed to, who's in that organization, that nobody's security can be improved if it costs someone else their security. And this is what Lavrov kept saying before the invasion, that this is what's going on. You're talking about your security in Europe, and we're not threatening anybody there. I mean, the idea that Russia's going to sweep across Europe at the same time they're losing in Ukraine, but they're also going to be crossing the English Channel anytime next week. I mean, the hypocrisy, but I would suggest getting a Russian to come and talk to you.
I'm suggesting it's even deeper than what you're saying. It's even deeper in the sense my grandparents were from Odessa. There are so many people whose grandparents are from Russia. They're not proud of saying that when they get asked, where are you from? They are proud of Irish, Spanish, every nationality. I'm saying it's very, very deep psychologically embedded. It's like anti-Slavic. It's almost like racism. I'm talking about that level, and I don't know how to do. What you're saying is persuading on the present the way they are, but we're going to have to work psychologically too, don't you think?
Well, you got to have courage to speak out, in this environment right now, because you're going to be smeared, as I've been. Anybody who writes in People at Consortium News, and myself included, Putin puppet, Bob Perry was smeared. He wrote about the coup in 2014. He wrote the first to write about the Nazis, one of the first. He wrote an article in 2015 that are you ready for a nuclear war in Ukraine? He combined the madness of Russiagate and the coup in Ukraine, and he said, this is a recipe. And I thought he was crazy. I thought he was over the top. What do you mean talking about a nuclear war over Ukraine? And now look what's going on. He was 8 years ahead of the times.
Joe, we can't hear you.
You cannot hear me?
I can hear him fine.
Oh,
I can hear him fine.
Oh, okay. All right. Maybe you had just stopped. Maybe you had just stopped talking.
That happens sometimes. I do stop.
Oh, okay. I thought I saw your lips still moving.
No more tax, no new taxes.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Ellen, for bringing up that deep concern and that reality. All right. Elizabeth, you have a question? Now you are still muted.
Yeah, it's about the mainstream media. And now
people say that the youth no longer watches the mainstream media, but just having CNN and MSNBC on, whether they're watching it or not, some people are watching it and nothing ever gets done. I mean, how do we, I remember during the AIDS demonstrations, AIDS people went and took over the studio. I mean, is that what we need to do? To go to CNN and take over and get our message across? How do you get your message across? That's the question. That's my question.
Yeah. It's very hard to get inside a studio these days.
Yeah.
As opposed to back, it was in the 80s. There wasn't that kind of security then.
Yeah.
I remember because I was a stringer at the New York Times when I was at City College of New York. I was a student campus correspondent. And that was my first paid job as a journalist. And I would walk into the New York Times newsroom off the street and just sit down and start working there. And I told them who I was and they knew who I was. So, but I just walked in. Nobody stopped me. So, remember the story, the movie, His Girl Friday with Cary Grant and Russell. Well, people walking in and out of that newsroom off the street all the time. Remember, that's the way I kind of says, that's what a newsroom should be like. You want the public in there, giving you news, finding things out. You want to have a connection. But now I don't know what to say to that question in terms of an answer, because it is really, really, they're losing that AP story that I read to you about this poll is encouraging. People have to not believe the mainstream media. And on top of that, believe that they're purposely deceiving the people. Now, AP said it was shocking. This was shocking. Like, in other words, they're wrong. Of course, we're given the truth. I mean, it's rubbish. They are so full of it. Having worked with these people for 25 years, they cannot see themselves. They are so in love with themselves. They are so arrogant and think they're in charge, and everybody else doesn't have a clue. And if you're not in the big newspapers, you're nobody. Because size makes right. You have a big paper with a huge circulation. Whatever you report is true. And if you're a smaller publication like ours, then whatever I write is false. And this is nonsense. Yeah. You can be one person, be the only one in the whole world saying the truth. Everybody else could be lying. So this is the way you can't get through to these people. I don't know how it could end, but we do need some change. I brought up the Cronkite example. Somebody's got to have the guts. I don't think they do anymore. That's the other problem. I think people had more guts in those days to actually stand up there but it was also pushed from the street. I know from Mike Gravel, I wrote a book with him, and he made it clear to me that the Senate he was in the Senate, so they knew what was going on the streets, the protests. It pushed, people want to get reelected, right? They don't. So this is the kind of numbers game is important because it's the corrupted democracy, a horrible electoral, money corrupted system, et cetera, et cetera. We all know that. But the real democracy is in the street because they know that if we're not going to get reelected, we may lose our heads if we don't listen to these people. But there's got to be a million, like we're in Central Park, and that led to the INF Treaty, and Gorbachev, it helped lead to them. It spurred the Americans to do something about nuclear weapons. Take out those missiles in Europe, which made it very much dangerous right now. It's a shame we don't have that right now, but I don't think the media had the kind of control over people's minds then as it does now. That's what we're fighting against. I don't have a good answer.
It's such an important question. And I'm sure I'm not the only person here that's been asking themselves that every day for such a long time. How do we get the message out? All right, now I'm going to turn to the next person, and I'm going to apologize in advance. Sane?
Yes, Sane Lauria. You hear me?
Oh, Sane. Yeah.
Hi. I was born and raised in Turkey, and as you may know, the Ottoman Empire and Turkey had long wars with Russia. I'm not a Russian sympathizer, and I had been in this country more than 34 years, and I'm not a tool of this empire or a sympathizer of this empire. But as someone who knows the region, someone who speaks both Russian, Ukrainian, and several other East European languages, Timothy Snyder has 23 free lectures online as part of a Yale University program. And as far as he knows, it's the only program about the history of Ukraine. There may be a few things you can learn from his lectures. You don't have to buy into his political line, but I'm sure he's speaking in terms of certain things that can be verified or refuted historically. 23 lectures, each close to an hour, so there's some information there. So as someone who follows the Russian media, he can give you examples of certain things that you may call fascistic coming from Russian generals. So in general, I agree that there has to be a de-escalation and some kind of agreement and a cessation of this war. And I do intend to be in the march, but I do not wish to lend my voice to an understanding that if the United States behaves, pulls back, the world will be a better place. I'm not sure if that is the case. I'm in favor.
What power is this? What power is as strong as the United States?
No, what I'm saying is there has to be a supranational power to stop both a country like the United States and a country like Russia, and maybe even China, which does not exist, I know, but I think we can at least speak in favor of something like that. Because to assume that United States is the only culprit, the only troublemaker, etc., is wrong. Russia was an expansionistic power long before the United States became an expansionistic power.
Right. And that was over, though. That was back in the 18th century. That's the period of Russian.
No, it started even before.
Well, I'm talking about,
one thing
I'm talking about Ukraine. In Ukraine. I'm talking about in Ukraine.
Well, Ukraine is older than Russia. This is one thing I learned.
The war against Ottomans, Turks, this is what Catherine the Great created. Imperial Russia in the Ukrainian territories today, right? The cities that we know today that were founded by them were at that period. That was a period of expansion. I don't agree that what Russia is doing now is imperialist. I don't think Russia is an imperialist. It's revanchist. It wants to recover territories that it once ruled. This is true. It's different than imperialism, because imperialism, you usually go to a place where the people there don't want you there. And you kill them, and you overtake them, and you control them, and there's rebellions against you, because this is imposing yourself on a completely foreign country, totally millions to thousands of miles away. The United States invaded Iraq, had nothing to do with U.S. security. Ukraine being trained by NATO with all the things I talked about had everything to do with Russian security. They had a reason to be worried. The U.S. had absolutely no reason to be worried about Iraq. And they went to a country that's speaking Arabic, that's nothing to do with the American culture, and they imposed themselves with soldiers there. That's imperialism. Russia's doing right now is to go into areas of Ukraine where it's largely Russian speaking, who've been attacked by the Ukrainian government that was installed after a coup. I mean, it's not the same. And I think the UN and the world, that doesn't mean that there aren't smaller bad guys, but they're the biggest bad guy. And they have to be curbed somehow, this power. They are the most dangerous country in the world. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Sorry.
Thanks so much, Sane. And now it looks like Barkev Callaghan. I'm sorry, I know I messed up your last name. Barkev, can you unmute? All right. While you oh, here you go. Okay, great. You are unmuted.
You want to ask your question, Barkey? Okay, maybe we should go on.
All right. Sharon?
Hi, thank you. Yes, so one of the things that keeps coming up in the discussions that I've been having with people is, well, Putin has been saying for years that he wanted to expand, make the Soviet Union, reestablish the Soviet Union, make that great again, and he was planning to invade Ukraine anyway. So how do you address that?
I don't think he ever said that he wanted to reconstitute the Soviet Union, because that would mean he'd have to invade the Baltics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. That's not going to happen. Armenia. No. What he has said, no question about it, is that those parts of Ukraine in particular are part of Russian homeland. They're the same people, things of that sort. I think he's revanchist. I do. I think that's different than imperialism. If it's only a technical difference, it's a difference in that you're not going to a foreign country to overtake, as they did from the Turks. Okay, the Turks control that part of Ukraine, and Russia beat them in the late 18th century. That was Russian imperialism, an empire, Russian Empire, Catherine the Great. Okay, this has been Russian speaking since then. And Putin's idea was to someday make it part of Russia again. I believe that's true. But did he do it? Until when? Only after the coup in 2014. Only after the so-called anti-terror war of the Ukrainian, backed by the United States and NATO, against the Donbass. If there hadn't been the coup, if there hadn't been that war launched against people who were trying to separate and become independent, I don't think that he would have had an opportunity to realize some of these revanchist ideas. And again, revanchism is different because I think a lot of the Russian speakers in Ukraine wanted him to come there. They want him to come and save them from the Nazis, from the Azov. Now, there are others who didn't want him there because it's not 100% Russian ethnic in those in the Donbass, but largely Russian ethnic, and they just voted to join Russia. From Russia's point of view, it's no longer part of Ukraine anymore. That's Russian territory. That's the Russians. Ukrainian and the international community has not agreed with that, but those people voted to rejoin Russia. Would the Iraqi people have voted right after the invasion to rejoin the United States? That's imperialism. This was to reunite those people again with Russia, to protect them from these monsters in Kiev that the Americans unleashed. So I don't think it's a great thing, revanchism. I don't like people going over borders. I don't like the violence that's involved here. I think, again, I said it was a mistake at the beginning because of the dangers of this war. I think the United States could have prevented this war. That's my position here, that they could have negotiated those treaties with NATO and Russia. They could have pulled back those troops. They could have implemented the Minsk Accords. They did none of that because they wanted Russia to invade. They needed Russia to invade. They got Russia to invade because without the invasion, there could be no economic war. There could be no proxy war to weaken Russia and overthrow Putin. There could be no information war against him. And there could be no blowing up of the pipeline, by the way, which is pretty certain the United States did that. I just went and looked at an article I wrote in September in which I was pretty assumed there's no other suspect than the United States. And now Cy Hirsch has now written his piece in which he has a source who's close to the operation that detailed exactly how it was done. So they needed this war because the long-standing goal since the end of the 1990s was to go back to that kind of control and dominance in Russia. And they lost it. Putin is the problem. He's standing in the way. And they want full spectrum dominance. They don't want these neocons. They don't want any country standing up to the United States. They're megalomaniacs. America has to rule the whole world. That's the sphere of influence. That's the way the people here, some of the people here in Washington think. And they're out of control, and they've got the biggest military ever assembled. They're dangerous, they're crazy, and they're armed. And they're making the world a dangerous place. And I disagree with my Turkish friend there that the United States is the big problem. Yes, every country is corrupt and they're violent and there's all kinds of smaller problems, including his country, Turkey, Erdogan. I have no time for that guy. But this is the reality of the world. This is the empire of America's era. Maybe 50, 100 years from now, China will be an absolute out-of-control monster ruling the world. Very likely, if they get this kind of power. We're at a stage of empire here where we are fighting. We only have weapons right now to continue to hold on to what we got, and we're deluded about losing anything. We've lost Vietnam. That was the beginning. Lost Syria. We didn't overthrow Assad. We created chaos in Libya. Give me a war the U.S. has done well in recently. Why are they in so many wars? Why do we have to go to all these damn wars? I'm sorry. This is America's problem. We're Americans here, most of us here, and we've got to do something about it, and we're powerless. This is one of the purposes of this meeting, the feeling of utter powerlessness. I fortunately have an outlet where I can publish other people's articles. I could write my own articles. It gives a feeling, a small feeling, that at least I'm still free to say these things, to have a discussion, to be brought onto a show like this or a meeting like this and have an open discussion. We can still do that in the United States, and that's great. But it's very limited. And you feel better maybe speaking, but what's materially what's changed? Very little. So again, get out in the streets seems to be the only way that I could think of right now.
All right, thank you. Thank us all for speaking truth. Barbara, do you have a question?
You have to unmute Barbara. Please unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I was just going to bring up the issue of Cuba. I mean, think about how the U.S. has reacted to anyone in our environment who may be, friendly with another nation. What do? That's just the way the world is set up right now. We have our neighbors who we count on as our protectors. And Russia feels that way about the Ukraine. I mean, they have a really long history with Ukraine. And militarily, and commercially, they need that area to be, relatively free. Well, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of issues about it, but I think, people really believe the media, and the media is really sophisticated now, because they will, if they want to say something, other than what they're supposed to say, they'll put it in one sentence in the middle of a paragraph, and then you don't really get it. So that's how they do it. Anyway, I don't know. Anyway, I think the whole thing is horrible. Spending hundreds of billions of dollars on wars when there are people who need that money and people who do not want to die in wars. Let's end it, for Christ's sakes. Did I say anything relevant? Did you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's relevant.
All right. Amar, I believe you have a question.
Yeah, I think my question was addressed, Joe.
Oh, okay, great. Well, I see that we are coming towards the ending of our time. And let me see. Edward's back now. Edward, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, please. I'm interested in the media narrative that we hear about the Ukraine. It seems to be so one-sided. We know part of it is because it's blocked on social media, but the mystery is the national media. During the Iraq War, we had embedded journalists that gave the story that was a dog and pony show that was given by the government. But in this case, it seems to be more, it's actually in a different way. I'm just thinking perhaps there's a lot of positive coverage coming from the NED, was it National, what is it called? The NED, the National
Endowment for
Democracy. They're funded by the U.S. government, and they're given the edict to produce positive stories to make the United States look good. I'm just wondering if we could get some comment about that.
Well, as I mentioned the NED before.
Yeah. But how is the process?
Right now,
they're paying reporters, aren't they, to make positive stories?
Look, if you look, Samantha Power just tweeted a film of her. She's in Hungary right now, right? And she's starting up these groups to teach them civic rights and media and how to protest. It's exactly what happened in Ukraine before. That Victoria Nuland said they spent $5 billion over a decade to create grassroots democracy. They're doing it in Hungary now. Watch in a year and a half, big protests, maybe sooner, outside the presidential palace in Budapest. I'm telling you right now, they want to get rid of Orban because he's not getting with the program with the rest of the European Union. I have problems with him. He's an anti-immigrant. I think he's a bigot, but he's not just taking on the anti-Russian chorus that you are required to take. And I think they want to get rid of him. And I think that's advertising right now. So you got to be careful about the NED. Read the article by David Ignatius in the Washington Post called Innocence Abroad, something like that. I can't remember the exact title. And he explained, it was the very beginning, what is the NAD for? To do what the CIA used to do covertly, they're now doing openly, change governments. So the purpose of it was from the very start. And, you know, the problem is in the suppression of the things that we've been talking about tonight in a very, very strongly and tightly narrowly managed corporate media. There have been historians who have said that the Second World War, one of its big causes was the Versailles Treaty. The Germans were angry. It was unfair to them. It led to Hitler and World War II. Does anybody accuse the historians, Western historians, British, American, of being pro-Nazi? Of course not. But if we try to talk about the causes of this war, we're smeared as pro-Putin and pro-Russian. And I'm just trying, as a reporter, try to get the facts and tell them what it is. I don't have any ideology. I don't have any, but because I don't subscribe to their ideology, to their enforced narrative, then therefore I must belong to the other side. You can't talk to someone today without them trying to pigeonhole you into either being a Democrat or a Republican. I'm neither. Absolutely. Consortium News has nothing to do with either of those two parties. We're way outside our analysis from that two-party system. And we are not pro-Russian. We're looking at the facts. How did it happen? I quoted you. There's Mearsheimer is another one. Listen to Ray McGovern. I'm telling you that Keenan, all these people, I mean, these are serious people who know Russia a lot better than I do. And that's why I'm drawing on what they were saying, that this was a mistake expanding NATO. You could read Brzezinski. You could see what they did in the 90s. They want to get back to it. Listen to Biden's words in Warsaw. We're overthrowing Putin. And they try to take that back. So he didn't really mean it. Yeah. We don't overthrow governments, Blinken said the next day. Of course not. I mean, you know, the more you study this thing, and the longer I've been writing about international affairs, based at the UN 25 years. I lived in Iraq for 2 years. I've lived in Cairo for 6 months, Australia 2.5 years. I've been in Britain 3 years and in Germany 3 years. I've lived different countries around a good part of my adult life outside the U.S. I have a totally different perspective of the U.S. because of that. I've given myself respites from the constant indoctrination here, just a relief to get out, not get that, and get the perspective from other peoples about how the U.S. is seen. And that's why I feel I have an internationalist view, and it gives me no joy to criticize the country that I was born in, grew up in, and still live in right now, and of whom I'm a citizen. But I'm just telling the facts as they are. That's the way I see it. It doesn't make me a Kremlin agent. It's about what Harrison, Hamilton 68 tried to say. Doesn't make any of us that. These are all complex issues, and I don't want to make it a black and white, good versus bad. I think it's bad versus bad. I covered international affairs long enough to know that all governments are pretty bad, and some are just worse than others. That's all.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joe. And as we come to the end of our time, I was going to check to see if you had any concluding remarks you want to make. And I feel like maybe you just did.
Yeah, I think I talked way too much. I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. I'm sure there's 10 other things I could find to say, but I'll leave it. Maybe until the next time. I really like the opportunity. You may not agree with everything I said or how I said it, but I'm really grateful that I had the chance to put out what I've learned, what I see, to help further our understanding and discussion about these terrible issues, and whatever we can do to talk to our neighbors, to people who don't really know very much, to inform them that there's another point of view than what you're getting on the TV. It's a good idea to try to do that. So thanks very much.
Yeah,
Thank you,
absolutely.
Joe.
Thank you very much. And just one final word. If anyone wants to be in touch with the No Cold War Committee, you can do so by writing to info@masspeaceaction.org. info@masspeaceaction.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for bearing with me. My analysis of facts. We can agree on facts, but we don't always agree on the interpretation of the analysis. Bye-bye.